So I'm going to begin with an introduction to biology. This is a list of the learning objectives that we're going to cover in this section. So in the first part of week 1's lecture, we're just going to give a basic overview of what biology is. So to begin, what is biology? Biology is the study of life. So ology is studying something and bio is talking about life. In order to study life, we have to understand what it means to be living. So the properties of life are listed below here, and we're going to explore each one of these properties individually as we go through these next few slides. Order, response to the environment, reproduction, adaptation, growth and development, regulation, homeostasis, energy processing, and evolution. To start with order, living organisms are made of cells. But smaller than the cellular level, you see here is the atomic level, and then it turns into the molecular level. The atomic level, or atoms, are building blocks of matter. Atoms come together to form molecules, so molecules are composed of 2 or more atoms. Those molecules come together to form organelles. And the organelles are the building blocks of a cell. Another way to define an organelle is by calling it a functional unit of a cell. So these are the individual mini organs of a cell that are going to do work for the cell and perform necessary functions for the cell. A cell is an individual unit of life. Cells are going to come together to form tissues. And those tissues come together to form organs. And the organs come together to form organ systems. And those organ systems come together to form the entire organism. Continuing on up the order, if we start organizing life in an ordered way, organisms of the same species are found in a population. So a population consists of organisms of the same species. From there, we have communities. Communities consist of multiple species coming together in a particular area. So here you can see both plant and animal species and multiple animal species and plant species coming together. These communities come together to form ecosystems, and ecosystems consist of living and non-living components. So it's not just the living organisms, now it's the interaction between those living organisms and the environment or non-living factors. Ecosystems come together to create what is called the biosphere. And the biosphere is basically anywhere on Earth where life is possible. Living organisms have to be able to respond to their environment. The example that's given here is the leaves of this sensitive plant will instantly droop and fold when touched. After a few minutes, the plant returns to normal. So this plant has the capability of responding to its environment. You have the capability of responding to your environment as well. When someone asks you a question, you respond. Reproduction, growth, and development. Living organisms have to have the ability to make copies of themselves or reproduce. This is one of the reasons why we say that viruses are not considered living, because viruses cannot independently fulfill the characteristics of life. They can't reproduce unless they're inside of a host cell. So reproduction is the ability to produce offspring or to replicate yourself. Growth is talking about an increase in cell size or cell number. And development is the ability for an organism to mature or to age. Living organisms have to have some type of regulatory mechanism, so regulation, and homeostasis. If something goes off inside of a cell, some process that's normally functioning stops functioning properly, we need to be able to adjust to that change. And if we can't adjust to it and it keeps going wrong, then we end up developing a disease state in that cell. An example that I can give you is the thermostat and homeostasis. So homeostasis is talking about internal consistency. Stasis means to stand still. So when we're talking about homeostasis, we're talking about an organism, a cell, or a person, an animal, maintaining a consistent internal environment. If the body's in homeostasis, then everything's functioning properly. But oftentimes we have changes in our environment. We have to be able to respond to those changes. So the example that I'll give is the house thermostat. If your house is in homeostasis, then the thermostat is set to 70 degrees and your house is actually 70 degrees. Now let's say someone opens a door or a window on a really cold day. Well, the temperature in the house drops. That alerts the thermostat that, hey, the temperature in the house has dropped, which sends a signal to the heater to turn on your heat. The heat will run until the problem is solved and the house gets back up to the set temperature according to your thermostat. And then the system will shut off. Now the house is back in homeostasis. So we have these homeostatic imbalances that happen all the time. We have things that happen in our environments that we have to be able to respond to. So negative feedback is the example that I just gave, and we can apply it to a person getting hot and cold as well. And there's a lot of other examples that I can go into with more advanced endocrinology and that type of stuff. But with negative feedback, the response shuts off or decreases the original stimulus. So, if a person goes outside on a very cold day, you have this part in your brain called the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus regulates your body temperature. If your body temperature gets too low, the hypothalamus puts into play a motion to make your body shiver. And you will shiver, which causes an increase in skeletal muscle contraction, which leads to friction, which leads to heat production. And you're going to shiver until your body gets back up to normal body temperature, or an acceptable body temperature to your hypothalamus. Opposite happens if you're hot. You go outside and it's hot outside, your body temperature is going to increase, blood's going to be routed toward the surface of your skin in order to try to cool you off, and as it's on its surface, it's going to start evaporating out sweat. Through evaporative cooling, your sweating will cause you to cool. Positive feedback is a little bit different. With positive feedback, the response exaggerates or enhances the original stimulus. So the example that they give here is breaking a blood vessel and forming a platelet plug in that broken blood vessel. When you break the blood vessel, you've got blood leaking out of the blood vessel. Platelets are going to stick to the wall of the broken blood vessel. As soon as a platelet sticks, it's going to produce chemicals that will call more platelets to the area. Now those platelets will also stick and will also produce chemicals. So now you have an exaggerated response. You've got a lot more chemicals coming to the air, or being produced. Now when those chemicals are produced, more platelets are going to be called, more chemicals, more platelets, more chemicals, until eventually you have this entire platelet plug formed here. Positive feedback will exaggerate and continue until some big event happens. Another example of positive feedback is going into labor. So the hormone oxytocin regulates uterine contractions. Oxytocin is released from the brain. When oxytocin is released, it stimulates the uterus to contract. The uterus contracts, pushes the baby's head down on the cervix, causes the cervix to dilate. And the nerve stimulation of cervical dilation sends a signal back to the brain to release more oxytocin, which causes more uterine contractions, more cervical dilation, more release of oxytocin. And this builds and builds and builds until the baby is delivered. Then you do it all over again to deliver the placenta. But through a positive feedback mechanism, it kind of spirals out of control until some big event happens. Positive feedback mechanisms have the ability to cause homeostatic imbalances. A homeostatic imbalance is a disturbance in homeostasis. Many homeostatic imbalances can be corrected by negative feedback mechanisms that happen in an organism. Something's off balance, you fix it, and it goes back to normal. But in some cases, homeostatic imbalances can progress to disease, and positive feedback mechanisms can lead to the progression of disease. So I'll give the example, you see a heart here. There's blood vessels on the surface of the heart. Now your heart is a muscle, and it actually needs nourishment. It needs nutrients from your bloodstream. So even though there's a lot of blood floating around in the inside of the heart, the muscle tissue itself actually needs to be fed. So you've got blood vessels on the surface here. Now if this person spent his life eating, not so great diet, a lot of fats and cholesterol in the diet, this person's likely to have a lot of LDL. And LDL, its main job is to transport cholesterol into the tissues. And we need cholesterol for some stuff, making hormones and so forth. But when you have cholesterol in excess in your tissues, it starts to accumulate, and particularly in the walls of blood vessels. So now you got these blood vessels, these little tubes that are trying to feed your heart. And slowly but surely, you are blocking them with plaques of fats and cholesterol. Now, if that gets completely blocked, that's going to build and build and build and build. Eventually, once it's blocked, then you're going to suffocate part of the heart, and part of the heart's going to die. And that's what a heart attack is. A portion of the heart dies because you've basically suffocated it. You've cut off its nutrient supply. Through the course of time and through positive feedback mechanisms, these homeostatic imbalances do have the potential to cause disease and potentially even death of the organism. Living organisms have to have the capability of energy processing. So all living organisms have to do some type of work. So they have to either produce energy or release energy or do something that's going to perform work. Now if we look at this picture here, we have organisms that are designated as producers. Producers produce energy for other organisms. They produce their own carbon source using the sunlight. So our producers are going to be plants. So plants go through the process of photosynthesis, where through photosynthesis they're capable of making their own sugars. And then they can use those sugars for energy production or for building things inside of the cell and so forth. But then these producers, these plants, can also be eaten by consumers. So consumers are going to consume either other consumers or they're going to consume producers. So animals are typically thought of as being consumers. Then you have the decomposers. The decomposers are going to decompose or decay dead organisms. Decomposers consist of bacteria, fungi, so all the different molds, like the bread mold that you see growing on your bread in your cabinet. Those are decomposers. They are going to decay dead organisms. Living organisms have to be able to evolve. And there's a whole section later on in the semester that talks about evolution. But what evolution is and how we define it in science, sometimes people think about it a little bit differently than what scientists actually kind of throw out there as a definition of evolution. But the basic definition of evolution is a change from generation to generation. Change in a population from generation to generation. So we're not talking about how if I were to have a daughter, my daughter would look different from me. We're talking about if 100 people had children, there would be a trait that would be noticed that would be different in the descendants of those 100 people. So an example that I like to give with evolution, an example that we can see happening today that kind of demonstrates evolution, is the rise in antimicrobial resistance. So these bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. So this is how it happens. Patient comes in with an infection, so they've got a bacterial infection. Now, as these bacteria replicate, they mutate spontaneously. So they change their genetic makeup spontaneously. It happens all the time. It even happens in our cells. So there's these mutations that happen. Sometimes the mutations confer drug resistance. So sometimes, since these bacteria are replicating, every 20 minutes they're making a copy of themselves, and they're doing this so quickly that there's a good potential that some of these are going to be mutated. So as millions of these cells are replicating inside of your body, there's a chance that a couple of them are going to be resistant. So now you've got this clump of bacteria growing inside of a wound. Let's say you had a cut on your arm. And you expose this clump of bacteria to an antibiotic. Well, if you take the full course, what's going to happen is the antibiotic is going to kill all of these in green, and it'll leave the one red one. But that's not a problem because your immune system will take care of that one red one. But let's say you take the antibiotic, and then after a couple days you're feeling better and you stop taking the antibiotic. Antibiotic concentrations in the bloodstream were rising, and suddenly they just dropped off. Well, now with that low antibiotic concentration, you've just given this one an opportunity to start replicating again. And because there's safety in numbers, because enough of these guys are still around to protect it, now this one's going to replicate and replicate and replicate, and now you're going to have tons of these. So let's say you get sick again and you're like, oh no, I shouldn't have stopped taking my antibiotic. Let me take it again. Well, now you kill off all the ones that were susceptible, leaving just the resistant ones. And now these resistant ones will continue to grow, and you will continue to be sick with this microorganism. Descent with modification. Our modification is our mutation, and we're changing from one generation to the next. Because this generation wasn't resistant at all over here, this generation had only one that was resistant, and now this generation had almost all of them that were resistant. So over the course of a period of time, after many generations, you'll notice differences, and that's what evolution is, at least in this aspect of the course.